Well, I want to welcome each one of you as we continue our study into the religion of Islam. And today we're going to be looking especially at the history of Islam, especially right after Prophet Muhammad's time. And we're going to look at the religion of the empire, because as we said last time, when Muhammad died, there wasn't a huge empire. It was basically a religion for Arabia. So we're going to go over, start with talking about the religion of the empire, and then we'll go to a little bit of the history of the conquests, the Islamic conquest, right after Muhammad, for about the first 100 years after that. So the first four caliphs, because you remember, these are considered, especially by Sunnis, the rightly guided, or Rashidun caliphs. So you have Abu Bakr, who was the caliph, the head of the Islamic Ummah for 2 years, from 632 to 634. You have Omar after that for 10 years. Then you have Uthman for about 10 years. And then you have Ali, that was in charge of the Ummah for about 5 years. And we can see the leadership became a key question in early Islamic history. They wanted one leader, as Muhammad had been for the Muslim Ummah. So this was very critical, and as you look at Islamic history, this is one issue that is, to call it important is an understatement. So we'll look a little bit at each one. Abu Bakr, he was a companion of the Prophet, one of the first converts to Islam. And actually, when they were trying to decide, because some of the people of Medina wanted the Medinans to be, Omar came in, found out they were meeting, and they said, no, somebody of the companion of the Prophet. Probably Omar should have been the first caliph, but he committed to follow Abu Bakr, who was a bit older, and he galvanized the Ummah, everybody, and there's some that say maybe with the threat of force, and Abu Bakr became the first caliph. He fought what the Muslims call the Ridda Wars, or Wars of Apostasy, that is fighting against the other Arab tribes that wanted to back out of Islam and didn't want to pay especially anything to the Quraysh, or this new tribe, or this new religion. And he was a proponent of force. Omar, his helper, was not. But through this, he united the Arabs, and he was known as the As-Sadiq, that is the truthful. So this is just an overview of Abu Bakr, who Abu Bakr was. The main thing is he kept the Ummah together there on the Arabian Peninsula. And then Omar he died only 2 years after Muhammad died. And then Omar became the next caliph. He was also a companion of the Prophet. At one time, he'd been a bitter opponent of Islam. He's known for having a brilliant military mind, being a strong soldier. Most of the conquests, or beginning of the conquests, came in his rule. He was a strict ruler. He set up basically a system that would enable them to run an empire. And he was known as Al-Faruq, the one who distinguishes between right and wrong. Very intelligent, good orator, loved poetry and literature, was a good politician. And you remember from the Arab culture, being able to speak poetry and speak beautifully was a huge asset to anybody. And basically, he's the one that's credited with the foundation of the Islamic Caliphate, to have one leader, one empire. He ended up being assassinated by a Persian slave in revenge for the Persian conquest, because they overcame Persia during his rule. So he died in 644 CE, and he was the founder of kind of the caliphate, of what we understand a caliphate today. Uthman came after him. He was of the Banu Umayyah tribe, the Quraysh. He was a very wealthy man, very generous, and he was appointed by a committee of 6, because Omar realized that establishing who was going to be caliph was going to be difficult, so he established a committee. The empire began to flourish financially during his rule. He was not as strict as Omar. He was a lenient ruler. During this time, this is the time the Quran was actually collected and written down, because up until that point, it had only been memorized by people who had been a companion of the Prophet. He did not allow soldiers to acquire land in conquered territories. He actually favored the dhimmis, that is the non-Muslims. And the empire grew so fast that he placed his kin as the governors, was accused of nepotism, and actually there were huge riots against him because of this, and he ended up being assassinated in 656 by an angry mob, and that was the end of Othman. Well, it turns out the next caliph was Ali. He was the first convert to Islam, was a cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. He was selected as the caliph under pressure from rebels, and I've listed those on the screen. And actually some of these rebels were the same ones that had assassinated Othman. And he replaced all the governors who were Othman's kin, who Othman had put in, except Muawiyah the first in Damascus. And Muawiyah will become a very significant character in Islamic history. He was very religious, from all accounts, was fair and kind, concentrated on agriculture, enjoyed the lifestyle of his Arab forefathers of living in the desert, and he dealt harshly with any rebellions. He wanted to keep the unity of the Ummah, but he ended up being assassinated by a Kharijite, which we'll talk about them in a few minutes, and that was the end of him in 661. Well, this was, Ali was there for the first fitna, and this word fitna in Arabic can mean persecution, it can mean trouble, trial, just a difficult time. And the first time like that, fitna, when that's the way I'll refer to it, so you need to know that, is that Aisha, who was actually the wife that Muhammad took when she was very young, as most people here in the West talk about, and Talha and Zubair and Muawiyah, the governor of Damascus, wanted Ali to punish Othman's killers. Well, Ali didn't punish the rebels because they were many of his supporters, and they gathered together in Mecca to figure this out, and then Ali ended up moving to Basra in Iraq, and they fought Ali at the Battle of the Camel. Aisha and Muawiyah, and Ali won. But the disobedient, Nakhathin, they rejected Ali as the caliph. So this is the first time when you see in the Islamic community where one of the community says, that's not my caliph. We're not going to be with them. Well, so they got together again at the Battle of Siffin. This is a very important battle that you must know. And Ali and his side were winning. And Muawiyah had his soldiers put up portions of the Quran on their spear tips. And they held them up as an appeal for arbitration. Well, they got together, and both Muawiyah and Ali, to resolve this, agreed in the arbitration not to be the caliph. So they agreed that they were going to figure out, the whole community was going to decide, but afterwards Muawiyah basically recanted and said, no, I was joking, and I'll be caliph. Well, Ali didn't even go along, and he didn't even try to fight for his right to remain the caliph, because he had been the caliph and he had been winning, and it appeared to be this great ploy. And the people that left are called the Kharijites, and that's the word means kharaja in Arabic, it means to go out, and they broke off from Ali and they said, no, you should be the caliph, and if you're not going to fight for it, then we're not even going to be with you. So the Kharijites actually separated from Ali. Well, how does this all play into Islamic history? Well, the Sunni and the Shia, most of you have heard of Sunnis and Shias. The Sunnis were the ones who accepted Muawiyah as their leader. He was the ruler in Damascus. And the Shia were the ones that accepted Ali. And after Ali's death, most accepted Muawiyah as the caliph because Ali ended up dying in 661. Well, when Muawiyah was in power, then he moved, obviously, the capital from Iraq to Damascus, where he was. And since this time, since 661, you've had the Sunnis and the Shias, and I have, again, a picture there, or a graph showing the distribution of where the Sunnis and Shias live now. And you can see the Shias are concentrated around Iraq and Iran, which is where Ali had been. And the Sunnis are more in the Arabian Peninsula and basically the rest of the Islamic world. And those were the followers of Muawiyah who went with the tradition. And if the community decided it, they were going to decide it. Well, the second fitna, or second period of trouble, was when Muawiyah appointed his son, who he had agreed with Ali's son, who was leading the Shia over in Iraq. He'd agreed that neither of them would appoint their successors. Well, he reneged on that as well, and he appointed his son Yazid to be the caliph when he died at 680. This angered many, even in the Sunni community, because dynasties were un-Arab. So just follow your father. That wasn't the way the tribe had done it. The tribe chiefs had always gathered together and had figured out a way to elect who was the most worthy. And many of the Muslims were, very pious and believed in prayer and being spiritual, and they found Yazid was too fond of worldly pleasures, and so they weren't happy that he was elected as the caliph. So this created another division. Well, Hussein, in October of that year, 680, the people of Kufa had invited Hussein there because he was now the leader of the Shias. His brother had basically had peace with Muawiyah because his brother Hassan had been before him. After Ali had died, then Hassan led the Shia, now Hussein. And Hussein was more aggressive, and he said they needed to offer resistance against Muawiyah and now Yazid, his son. Well, Hussein took a force from Medina to Kufa, which is in Iraq, because the people in Kufa had invited him to come there. Well, Yazid was under instructions by his father that he needed to take care of the Shia, and he'd sent an army there to meet and fight against Hussein. And in Karbala, in Iraq, the Syrian force met Hussein's force, and the whole delegation was slaughtered. And if you've ever seen, and I put a picture up here of what they call Ashura, and this is the date that the Shias commemorate this terrible massacre, because the whole group was massacred and then burned, and it was a terrible event. And to this day, I'll just put up a slide here. There's still a real disagreement amongst Muslims if Shias are actually true Muslims. It says Shias are not Muslims. Shias do not represent Islam. Shias are the enemy of Islam, and Muslims, may Allah punish them, from the Islamic Thinkers Society. This is where it stems from. These basically two events of Muawiyah and Ali, and then Muawiyah's son Yazid fighting Ali's son Hussein and killing him. And so the Shia, and we'll look at that at a next lecture, kind of went underground for a time, and the Sunnis, Yazid and Muawiyah's side, basically won. And but actually, I'm putting up a slide now about Abdallah ibn al-Zubayr. He was actually still remaining caliph of Medina, and he was resisting the Umayyads, who was another name for Yazid and the family of Yazid and Muawiyah. And he had a loyalty of a large portion of the empire, and he fought them at Marj Rahit. And in 692, he was killed in an Umayyad attack. And after that, the Umayyads basically controlled the entire empire and basically solidified it for Sunni Islam. As I said before, the leadership was a key issue, and you can see this is why they were fighting. This is why Muawiyah and Ali, this is why Yazid and Hussein, and fighting against this other Abdallah ibn al-Zubayr, they were fighting for supremacy to be that leader of the Ummah. And they were dependent upon that. This is the way they had acted in Medina when Muhammad was alive, and then on Mecca when at the last 2 years of his life. And the proper title for the leadership was the Caliphate Rasulullah, that is the deputy of the servant of God, or the messenger of God. But they ended up just taking the title Khalifat Allah, that is the deputy of God. So they ended up ascribing to themselves more power, not just the deputy of the servant of God, but the deputy of God himself, that is, speaking for God. And this produced an atmosphere of reverence for the leader of the Muslims, because if one rejects the leader, one rejects God. And it's somewhat similar to what happened in medieval Christianity with the Bishop of Rome and taking on the title of speaking for God. And this became very prominent in Islamic thinking. Well, the Arabs were zealous monotheists, and so whenever they did go out and fight, they really believed God was on their side and that he was giving them this new land, and that to reject their conquest was to reject God, because God had been with them. They'd seen them grow from a tiny little group in Mecca to this big group in Medina to even a bigger group of the Arabian Peninsula. And in the next part of this presentation, we'll get in and see that they even went further than Arabia. But let's look at a little bit of their colonial policy when they did go out, before we look at where they actually went. So Omar, that is the second caliph after Abu Bakr, he discouraged assimilation, and he actually confined the Arabs to garrison cities. He would not allow soldiers to take over land, but he created what was called the Diwan, like a couch, which was an official register of allowances to Muslims from conquered property. So somewhat like an entitlement program, but it was a very orderly process. It wasn't just Muslim soldiers going out and conquering land, taking it for themselves. In fact, when Omar went, he kept them in their cities, and they had this regular policy of what they could get. One of the very interesting things and surprising things when I studied Islam is now scholars, when they're looking at this, when they see the early Muslims, the early Muslims viewed their religion as peculiarly Arabic, and they were surprised when non-Arabs decided to convert. In fact, in order to have a convert, they had to become honorary Arabs at first, and they called them mawali or maula, clients, and you had to become honorarily affiliated with a tribe of their patrons. And then these non-Arabs, or the dhimmi, were assessed two taxes: a head tax, jizya, and a land tax, kharaj. And we'll talk about that here. So the jizya, a lot of people talk about it in the West in a negative way, but let's look at it, what it actually was. It was a tax for the non-Arab Muslims when they were conquering these new territories. However, women, children, the insane, poor, monks, handicapped, temporary residents, and if you were a convert to Islam, you were exempted from this. And what they viewed the jizya for is that it was for allegiance of new territories and payment for Islamic protection from outside sources. So let's just get this straight, because the perception we have is that the Muslims just all of a sudden, with Muhammad, even though it didn't happen at the time of Muhammad, it happened after him, went out and conquered everybody by the sword, and everybody became Muslim. Well, two things. A jizya actually, and I didn't mention this, it actually would have been a discouragement for the Arab Muslim soldiers to have forced conversions. It was financially beneficial to leave the local people in their religion that they were in already. That is, why have a forced conversion if you can keep those people there and then they give you a tax? But number two was that they viewed this was as protection, that the Arab armies were going to go out and fight. The dhimmis didn't have to go fight, but the Arab armies were going to go fight, and they would protect this. And so therefore this tax was actually for protection. And interestingly enough, the monks and priests did not have to pay this jizya, is that they actually gave an exception to the religious leaders and kept them in their religion. And we'll look at that here in a few minutes. So their piety. The early Muslims were very pious. We've already talked about the 5 pillars of Islam. They strongly believed in the worship of God. This is the Shahada. There's only one God. And it's interesting, if you study early Islamic sources, there are very few mentions of Muhammad. They viewed themselves more as the worshipers of this one God. Muhammad's importance, we see in Islamic history, grows over time. That is, as there became disputes in the community, they all wanted to reference, well, Muhammad said such and such. And that this was a way of giving legal basis for the way you believe the Ummah was supposed to behave. So Muhammad ended up becoming important. We see that in the Hadith, and we'll talk about the Hadith in a later presentation. And the Hadith are all of these collections of Muhammad, of things that he said, but they really didn't come about into being until much later. In fact, hundreds of years after Muhammad was the first time they were really collected and brought around. And interestingly enough, the Quran and the mention of the Quran was also not found often in early documents. Just an interesting thing to note. The conquests. So where did they conquer? And I put up here a picture on the screen showing the amount of territory superimposed over the modern day countries. And if you look at that, it's just an enormous amount of land. This is within 150 years. Well, by 750, so about 120 years from the time of Muhammad's death, this was a territory that had been taken over. All the way from Spain, you can see there on the far western and western Africa, near Morocco, and all the way over to present-day India and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Persia. So it was just a massive amount of territory, and we're going to look at a little bit how that happened. Number one, we said that the Byzantine and Persian or Sasanian empires had been fighting each other for a while by the time Muhammad was there. And Khusrau had attacked the Byzantine Empire. He was the leader of the Persian Empire. 613, Antioch had fallen, 614, Jerusalem, 619, Egypt. And by 620, they were getting near Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. So it almost looked like the Byzantine Empire was going to fall. What's interesting is that in the Quran, in the 30th surah, in the second ayah to the fourth, it prophesied that the Romans would be victorious. So it looked like, and that's what the Quran refers to as the Byzantines, were the Romans, because this was the Eastern Roman Empire, so they refer to them as Romans. And sure enough, from 622 to 628, Heraclius came into power as a Byzantine emperor. He fought them off in a series of battles. Khusrau was deposed, the one that was leading out on all these battles, and 10 different kings came in the next 4 years. So you can see there was great upheaval in the Persian Empire. And by 632, the year that Muhammad had died, both empires were absolutely in disarray. But the Byzantines had basically staved off the Persians, and they were kind of these tired empires. Well, as soon as Muhammad died, remember Abu Bakr, who we just talked about, he ended up not fighting anybody else except other Arabs, trying to keep this Ummah together, and subdue and unite the whole Arabian Peninsula. So he really didn't make any conquest. So by 634, they really hadn't gone anywhere. They'd only stayed there on the Arabian Peninsula. And you can see this on this next map. I'll show another map. And the different colors are the years of their conquest. So if you look at the deep purple, this is the area that had become Islamic by the time of 632 at the death of Muhammad. And you can see it's basically the Arabian Peninsula there, except that even that northern section wasn't. However, up to 661, which is when Ali died, if you look at the lighter green, then that's a whole another section there with Persia, Armenia, Syria, and Egypt falling, and we'll look at that here in a minute. Then if you look at the dark green, that was up to 750. That was after the conquest of the Umayyad caliphs, and that's with the Berbers of North Africa, Spain, and then all the way up into past Persia, into Central Asia, and even a little bit more there of Asia Minor, which was part of the Byzantine Empire in modern-day Turkey. So by 750, that was the Islamic Empire, a huge piece of land. And this is where they started. This was the invasion of Iraq by Khalid ibn al-Walid. And he fought, you can see there on the map, he fought these different battles. And we're not going to go into all those battles. You're more than welcome. You can probably find them online of what happened at each one. But Iraq was the first one that really fell, and that's why Ali and his sons ended up there, and why Karbala to this day is the holy place of the Shia Muslims, and why their pilgrimage is made there, is that it was established basically first as they were leaving the Arabian Peninsula, and Khalid ibn al-Walid is the one who led them there, and wherever there's some swords there was a battle, and wherever there's a box there was a siege, and they took over that part of Iraq. So Syria, they also, in 634, right after Abu Bakr had died, and right as Omar was coming in, they invaded Syria. In 636, the Battle of Yarmouk occurred. They defeated a superior Byzantine army and actually occupied Damascus at that time, which is where Muawiyah ended up ruling. 638, they conquered Jerusalem, and in 640, they conquered Caesarea. So you can see within 6 years of Omar coming in, they'd basically overtaken what we consider the Holy Land and that whole region there around the eastern end of the Mediterranean. And Yarmouk was a big battle. That was the battle that really surprised the Byzantines, and that's why we said the Byzantine Empire was fairly tired. They were somewhat surprised coming off of the Arabian Peninsula, this new, very zealous group of Islamic fighters were coming. Next is Egypt, 641. They established garrison at present-day Cairo. And Alexandria was taken in 642, then lost, then retaken back in 646. So by 646, they basically had Cairo and Alexandria, the two main centers of Egypt, under control. And now they had from Cairo up that end of the Mediterranean, because they'd overtaken Caesarea, Jerusalem, and Damascus, and they also had Iraq. So by 646, they had already a fairly large empire. And especially considering in 636, they also went into Persia and beat a Persian army. 637, they took the capital, Ctesiphon. 649, they conquered Persepolis, which had been the historic place of where Darius and Cyrus had their palaces and homes and when they were buried. And by 651, they had most of Persia also under control. So by 650, they already had a very large empire. Muawiyah ended up constructing a navy, and in 655, a Byzantine navy was destroyed. 673, already Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, was under siege. In 711, they conquered Sind and began to rule in part of India. 711, they entered Spain. 715, Central Asia was taken. And in 732, they'd already gone through Spain, and there was a battle at Tours where Charles Martel defeated an Islamic force. And as I read one historian, and many historians propose, had Charles Martel not defeated them, it would have been very easy to get to places like Paris, London, Copenhagen, Oslo. And who knows what would have happened with world history had Charles Martel, who had developed a full covered stirrup and his horses were a little bit more maneuverable, and probably the Islamic forces were tired. They were a long ways from home, and they were turned back there in France. But France was under siege already by 732, exactly 100 years to the year since the time Muhammad died. 751, the Arabs defeated a Chinese army in Central Asia. 827, they began a conquest of Sicily in Italy. And 831, they captured Palermo and raided another raid in southern Italy. So you can see Europe, all of a sudden, this large empire that stretched from India to Spain, all of North Africa was up at the very gates of Italy and had been all the way up into France, even starting in the mid-700s. So quite a historic development, and I'll just go back to that map. But you can imagine the psychological impact this had on Europe. Just look at the map. You had a bunch of Arab tribes, couldn't even get along with one another, were living out in the desert as a bunch of just kind of wild Bedouins, tending their sheep with their camels, and they unite under a new religion, and within 120 years they've overcome huge swaths of territory from all of these other very historically powerful lands, places like Egypt, Persia, all the way to India, Armenia, which was a large kingdom back then. Actually, I ended up living in Armenia, Georgia, that whole area, the Caucasus, part of Turkey, Spain. It was amazing. And you can imagine what the Europeans were thinking at this time. All of a sudden, this group of Arabs has united this whole region of the world and basically sealing them in from Asia and Africa. So what was the psychological impact? Well, as Edward Gibbons talks about in his book, the fact they would talk about this, there was 200 days journey across the empire. It was just so big that probably psychologically, even if some of those places weren't that inhabited per se, not that many people, but just the fact of its size was just a bit scary for many people. Some Christians believed it was punishment for their sins. They actually viewed this as because the Muslims were telling them about some things, for instance, idols. They believed that having statues or icons was a sin, and they were telling Christians this. And some Christians began to believe that maybe God had allowed this as punishment for their sins. Some believed it was a fulfillment of prophecy, for instance, the prophecies about Daniel and the 1260 days, which if any of you are curious of, I also have on this Iron Range SDA YouTube site. I also have whole videos on Daniel 7 and 8, Daniel chapter 2, talking about some of the prophecies, talking about that time in the Middle Age. They use words like cruel bloodshed, ravaged. The Muslims came as a plague. And interestingly enough, the Muslims viewed it as a triumph not only of new religion, but also of justice, which is really what Sharia means. Sharia just means law. And when we say Sharia law, it's a little bit redundant. It's law. Sharia is just law. And where they were going, they were actually spreading law, rule of law. They actually had some form of justice. And it's one thing that why we mentioned when we studied in the first presentation on Islam is that the Christian Empire and Persian Empire weren't known for being as just as the Muslims when they would take over a place. So we have to wonder the psychological impact of Christians is, and people in the Western, what we call the Western European territory, obviously would have already a negative view of these new Muslims that were coming and trying to take over their territory. So when we read in our textbooks, how cruel and how they converted people with the sword and they were just these rapacious soldiers, bloodthirsty, coming in, we need to take that with a grain of salt because these were being recorded by people who weren't happy. They were losing their power, their influence, and they were going to have to pay this new tax in their land. And that's why this next slide, and if you look in textbooks now, as archaeologists are doing more research and they're being able to look at more of the original sources of this, there are very few archaeological evidences that support these Christian accounts of forced conversions, of whole towns becoming Christian, although I'm sure there were some. But it appears there were very few of them, and very few of sacking of the whole towns or destroying the places of worship. In fact, they're finding that even in some Muslim lands, there were new churches and new synagogues being built all the way into the 8th century. This is middle of their apex there after they came out and had been conquering for over 100 years, that they were still allowing churches and synagogues to be built. In fact, money didn't really change until about 700 AD. And they were just kind of using the same money that had been around in the Byzantine Empire and wherever they went and where they conquered. The language, they didn't really change the language to Arabic. They found evidence of wine production and raising of pigs, both which are haram or forbidden in Islam, that continued in Iraq and Syria, well after the Islamic conquest. So we have to ask ourselves, what did happen? And we'll end on this slide. What actually did happen with the Islamic conquest? Well, number one, military battles did occur. Hopefully you don't go away from this and say, well, we were told that, there were battles and this guy said there are none. No, there were military battles. There's no doubt about that. That was the way territory was won and lost, and whether you were Christian, Zoroastrian, or Muslim, you were willing to fight for your land and fight for your territory. And so battles did occur. But what did happen after the battles occurred, they had strict laws, and you can look at them in the Quran, of what to do. Basically, they're the same as in the Bible when they have this war, and how to be just. You only fight the soldiers that fight you. You don't fight the women and the children and the grandparents and whatnot. So what they would do after the battles occurred, they would change out the ruling elite, which should alert us that guess who's sponsoring all these written accounts of how we know how the Muslims took over? Well, it would be the ruling elite. Of course they didn't like them because the Muslims switched them out and put instead in every locality an Arab ruler. There was a continued and accelerated trend of Arab immigration. That is, you can understand why people wanted to get off, probably Arabs wanted to get out of the Arabian Peninsula, move to different places. For instance, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Persia, North Africa, Spain. And interestingly enough, persecution of heretical groups actually diminished. In fact, I remember reading some Nestorian documents of where the Nestorian Christians, who had been persecuted by the Byzantine Empire because they were followers of Nestorius, and Nestorius was viewed as a heretic, and they were chased out. And they actually said, may God bless the Arabs, and may God bless these new Muslims, may the sunshine shine upon these new Arab conquerors, because they actually give us more freedom to practice our own religion than the Christians do. What is interesting is that the Arabs did not accept, though, the religion of those conquered. They synthesized a new culture, but they did not synthesize a new religion. A lot of times, conquerors, when they would conquer, they would just kind of adapt their religion to their religion, and they didn't really take it so seriously. But the Arabs did not do that. They believed very strongly in the one God, this teaching, the Quran, and they held to that. They maybe synthesized the culture a bit, but they did not synthesize their religion, and they did not adopt their religion. They were very true to it. So, that's where we're going to end today for the Arab conquest. And I hope this has added some light to the way it happened, because what did actually happen, and how did Islam take over then those parts of the world, with the exception of Spain, where they got chased out. Basically North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, Pakistan, Central Asia, for the last 1,400 years, 1,300 years, have remained Islamic. Well, probably. Over time, some people probably got tired of paying the jizya, and they just said, hey, why don't we just become Muslims? And I don't think most historians would doubt that was the motivation of some people. However, what that would mean is that they would have to fight then also and go out with the Arab armies. So they wouldn't be exempt from military service, but if they did want to take the jizya. But there are others that I've read that suspect that probably, because it was a simple religion, there were only 5 pillars: praying, fasting, giving some of your money to the poor, going to Mecca, and believing in this one God. As that Christianity specifically, because many of those lands were Christian lands, some were Zoroastrian lands, is that it was a bit theoretical. They were arguing about heresies. They were arguing about things that were, pretty high in philosophy. Whereas the basics of life, prayer, leading a pious life, maybe it appeared better to most people, and just gradually, over generation from generation, many just accepted it. Were there some forced conversions? There probably were some. In fact, from what I've read, the Berbers of North Africa would be one group that appear that there was some forced conversion there. One thing is sure, as you dig deeper into this and as you study more, you become a bit more balanced, and you see that you can't say just, well, all of them were converted by the sword, or none of them were converted by the sword. The truth is a bit messier than that. And so next time we're going to look at the time period after this. What happened in Islam with the leadership, with the dynasties, with caliphate? How did the Turks enter the picture? What happened somewhat to their theology? And kind of how did we get, and eventually we'll get to how did Islam become what it is today, and what we're really facing in the West and even in Muslim lands, what they're dealing with, what they're fighting with. So I hope you'll join us next time as we continue this study and to understanding Islam.